The notary's office smelled like cheap cigars and expensive perfume, and the combination was enough to turn a person's stomach before they even crossed the threshold. Eleanor Voss stood in the far corner of the room, her back nearly touching the wallpaper that was peeling at its seams, its faded pattern of oak leaves darkened by years of cigarette smoke. She had positioned herself there deliberately away from the clusters of men in pressed suits who filled the available chairs and leaned against the mahogany furniture as though they owned it already, which by the end of the afternoon, most of them believed they would. She had not slept in 3 days. That was not entirely true. She had closed her eyes on the narrow cot in the back room of the house on Mendera Street, the house that had already stopped feeling like hers the moment Arthur stopped breathing in it. But sleep, real sleep, the kind that knits a person back together and returns them to themselves each morning, had not come. What came instead were the sounds of the house settling in the heat, the particular groan of the pipes. Arthur had never quite gotten around to fixing the scratch of a branch against the window. He had always meant to trim, the sounds of his absence louder than he ever was in life. 49 days. That was how long they had waited. Not out of respect, she understood that now, though she had not understood it when the first envelope arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, formal and cream-colored, and bearing the firm name of Aldrich, Boone and Parsons in embossed letters. She had held that envelope for a long time before opening it, standing in the same kitchen, where Arthur used to drink his coffee, standing up, looking out the window at the yard because he said sitting down to drink coffee in the morning was a habit for men who had already given up. She had held the envelope and thought it was perhaps a condolence, some legal formality of sympathy she was unfamiliar with. It was not a condolence. It was a summons to the reading of the will scheduled for the 49th day following Arthur Voss's death at the offices of Aldrich, Boone and Parsons at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Please be prompt. Please bring identification. She had not known there would be others. Looking around the room now, she counted 11 men, none of whom she recognized from the funeral, though several of them had the look of people who attended funerals regularly for professional reasons. They spoke to each other in low, assured voices, the voices of men who had never once in their adult lives doubted that they would end up on the right side of any arrangement. One of them, a broad man with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, caught her eye and looked away immediately the way a person looks away from something embarrassing in public. A stray dog, a woman crying, a widow standing alone in the corner of a room full of people deciding what to do with the things her husband had left behind. Reginald Boone called the room to order by striking the edge of his desk with a small rubber mallet, a theatrical gesture that Eleanor found grotesque. He was a thin man of 60 or so, with the kind of tan that comes not from outdoor work, but from calculated leisure, and he wore a suit the color of old bone that seemed designed to communicate his own estimation of his importance. He spread the documents before him with the practiced deliberateness of a man who enjoyed being watched arranging things. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and the phrase felt like a small cruelty given that there was only one woman in the room. "We are gathered for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Arthur James Voss, mechanical engineer, resident of Crail County, deceased on the 14th of last month." The men settled. Someone coughed. The silver-haired man in the front row uncrossed and recrossed his legs. Eleanor had known Arthur Voss for 31 years. She had known him before he was the man other people spoke about with grudging admiration, back when he was simply the young man who repaired the water pump at her father's property outside town and who had looked up from his work with grease on his forearms and said without any particular preparation or romance that he thought she was the most remarkable woman he had ever seen and that he intended to make something of himself so she might consider his company worth keeping. She had laughed because it was an absurd thing to say to a woman you had just met, and he had smiled at her laughter and gone back to the pump, and she had stood there in the afternoon light thinking that she had never before met a man who seemed entirely comfortable with who he was and completely determined to become something more simultaneously. She had married him 8 months later. Her father had disapproved. Half the town had raised their eyebrows because Arthur Voss at that point was nobody particular, a young man with clever hands and an education he had gotten mostly on his own from books borrowed from the county library, and her family had expected her to aim at something more conventionally impressive. But Eleanor had recognized something in Arthur that she could not have named then and could barely name now, something that had to do with a particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at problems, the way other people looked at locked doors as though the only real question was which approach would open them. He had made something of himself in the end, not in the way the town might have predicted, not through accumulation of land or capital or social position, but through the application of his mind to problems that other people had stopped trying to solve. His name appeared on 11 patents, none of which had made him wealthy in any immediate sense, but all of which had been purchased by larger enterprises and incorporated into systems that most people used without knowing his name. He was content with this. He used to say that the work was the point, that a solution that helped people was its own reward, and Eleanor had always believed he meant it entirely because Arthur Voss was constitutionally incapable of saying things he did not mean. The town had respected him and kept its distance from him, which in her experience amounted to the same thing. Boone was reading now, his voice moving through the legal language with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this many times and found it neither interesting nor distressing. The room was warm. The ceiling fan moved the air without cooling it. Eleanor focused on staying upright, on keeping her hands still at her sides, on not letting her face show the particular vulnerability that she knew these men would interpret as weakness and file away for future use. The first provisions were unremarkable. A modest savings account, some equipment at the workshop on 2nd Street, the truck that was 6 years old and starting to need work. These went to named individuals, former colleagues, and one nephew in Colorado, whom Eleanor had met twice and found pleasant. There was a small bequest to the county library, which surprised no one who had known Arthur, and a rather larger one to a scholarship fund for engineering students at the State University, which surprised Eleanor only in its size. Then Boone paused. It was a performer's pause, she realized, and she hated him for it. The remainder of the estate, he read, including the parcel of land designated in county records as Plot 7-G, commonly referred to as the Voss Salvage Yard, located at the eastern boundary of Crail County, at the margin of the Sonoran Formation, along with all structures, materials, and contents thereon, is bequeathed in its entirety to Eleanor Marie, Voss, wife of the deceased. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then the room came apart. It started with a sound that Eleanor would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and never quite getting right. It was not laughter exactly, not at first. It was more like the sound of a group of people simultaneously releasing a tension they had been holding, a collective exhale that carried within it something ugly and satisfied. And then it was laughter, real laughter, the kind that bends men forward in their chairs and makes their faces red. The silver-haired man in the front row was not laughing, but was smiling in a way that was worse than laughter. One of the younger men, perhaps 35, in a jacket that was slightly too large for him, was laughing so hard he had to press his hand against his mouth. "The scrap heap," someone said. "It is so." "He left her the scrap heap." "The Queen of Rust," said another voice, and this produced a fresh wave. Eleanor did not move. She was aware in a distant and clinical way of the heat in her face, of the slight unsteadiness in her knees, of the way the laughter seemed to press against her from all sides like something physical. She kept her eyes on Boone, who had lowered the document and was looking at her with an expression she would later identify as professional. To pity, the look of a man who feels faintly sorry for someone while simultaneously being grateful that their misfortune is not his own. What they were laughing at, she understood, was the gap between what they had expected and what had been delivered. These men, and she learned over the following days how they had come to be in that room, had been circling the possibility of Arthur Voss's estate for years, maneuvering through social and professional channels for access to the parcel of land at the center of town that Arthur had owned since before most of them had moved to Crail County. It was prime commercial land, a full city block in what had become over the past decade the most valuable district in town. Several of these men had made formal and informal offers over the years. Arthur had declined them all with a politeness that apparently concealed no particular warmth, and they had waited because men like this were practiced at waiting for circumstances to change. The circumstances had changed, but not in their direction. Arthur Voss, who apparently had a more precise sense of humor than Eleanor had fully appreciated during his lifetime, had given the town land to 3 separate charitable organizations jointly with restrictions on sale for 50 years, and had left his wife the salvage yard on the edge of the desert that everyone in Crail County had agreed for the better part of 2 decades was a worthless eyesore. Boone was saying something about her rights to contest about the timeline for processing about procedural matters that swam past her without landing. The laughter had subsided into something lower and more sustained, a current of amusement and contempt running through the room that she could feel against her skin. The silver-haired man had turned to speak quietly to the man beside him, and whatever he said produced a brief, sharp smile. Eleanor collected her copy of the document from Boone's outstretched hand. She put it in the canvas bag she had brought because she had not owned a proper handbag in years and had never particularly wanted one. She walked across the room and out the door, and she did not look at any of them, not because she was afraid of what she would see in their faces, but because she was afraid of what they would see in hers. The street outside was bright and dry and hot, the way it always was in the middle of the day in summer in this part of the world. A lizard crossed the sidewalk in front of her with the startling speed of desert things. She stood for a moment beside Arthur's truck, which was now legally her truck, and put her hand flat against the driver's side door, and the metal was hot enough to hurt, and she held it there anyway. The salvage yard was 11 miles east of town, out past the last of the residential streets, and the grain storage facility, in the place where the road changed from asphalt to packed dirt, and the vegetation thinned from scraggly mesquite to nothing much at all. Eleanor had been there twice in 31 years of marriage, both times at Arthur's invitation, on occasions she could no longer specifically recall, only that she had stood in the heat and the smell of rust and oil and waited while he walked among the wrecked vehicles with the focused pleasure of a person in a museum. She had not thought to ask him what he was doing there. She had not thought to ask many things. She drove out the following morning before the heat had fully arrived with the windows down and her hair pulled back and the document from Boone's office on the seat beside her. The road out to Plot 7G was worse than she remembered, or perhaps she had not been paying attention the last time, but the truck's suspension made its displeasure known over every rut and washboard stretch, and by the time the chain-link fence of the salvage yard came into view, she was holding the steering wheel with both hands and concentrating hard on the road ahead. She parked outside the gate and sat for a moment. From the outside, it looked exactly like what the men in that room had laughed at. Several acres of chain-link enclosure containing the rusted carcasses of commercial vehicles, primarily long-haul trucks of varying vintage, arranged in rows that had once been orderly and had now succumbed to the slow entropy of the desert. The sun worked on the metal at a molecular level, and you could see that work in the surfaces in the way color had been replaced by a deep orange-brown that was uniform and absolute, the way an old painting loses its particularity and becomes simply age. The gate was padlocked. She found the key on the ring with the others. The smell hit her before she was fully through the gate. Not unpleasant exactly, but complex and forceful. The smell of iron returning slowly to the earth it had come from, of rubber baking in decades of sun, of the particular mineral dryness of desert soil that has had the last of its organic content drawn out of it. She stood inside the fence and looked at what Arthur Voss had left her and tried to understand what she was looking at. The trucks were arranged more carefully than the overall impression of decay suggested. She noticed this gradually, the way she had learned to notice things through accumulation of details, rather than immediate apprehension. The rows were not random. The vehicles were grouped by size and perhaps by condition, though it was difficult to judge condition in something that looked uniformly destroyed. Some of the trucks had their hoods standing open, exposing engine compartments that were empty and scoured clean. Others were sealed, their doors welded shut, their surfaces continuous and uninterrupted. There was glass everywhere, windshields intact in many of the cabs, and it caught the early morning light and held it in ways that seemed deliberate, though she could not have said why. She spent 2 hours walking the yard that first morning. She cataloged what she could and understood very little. There were sections of copper pipe bundled and stored under one of the larger chassis. There were rolls of heavy black plastic sheeting stored inside several of the sealed cab compartments, protected from the sun. There was a central area approximately 40 feet across that had been cleared of vehicles entirely and leveled with a care that was visible even under the layer of accumulated sand and windblown debris. She did not yet know what the cleared area was for. She drove back to town in the early afternoon and began the process of vacating the house on Mineral Street, which belonged to a cousin of Arthur's and which she had been renting on a month-to-month basis for years, in which the cousin she learned through an intermediary rather than direct communication intended to reclaim promptly. She had 3 weeks. She packed what was hers, which was less than she expected, and donated what she could and discarded the rest. And she did not permit herself to think too carefully about what she was doing or what would come next, because thinking too carefully about those things led her to a place of very cold and very complete fear that she could not afford to inhabit. She moved into the salvage yard on a Tuesday, into the cab of the largest truck, a long-haul model from the early part of the previous decade that was positioned against the eastern fence in a way that caught the prevailing shade in the late afternoon. She had a sleeping bag and a camp stove and 2 weeks of canned goods and the water she could carry in the truck bed in 5-gallon jugs. She had Arthur's tools, as many as she could fit from the workshop on 2nd Street, which she had cleared out before the new tenant arrived. She also had the humiliation of the notary's office still sitting somewhere behind her sternum, the specific quality of being laughed at by people who considered you not worth the effort of hatred, which was in some ways worse than hatred because hatred at least conceded your significance. The laughter had said something she could not stop hearing. It had said that whatever she tried to do, whatever she became, she would always be a punchline in the telling of this particular story. The widow who got the junk heap. She did not sleep well that night. The desert made sounds. She was not accustomed to small sounds and large sounds, things moving across the ground, the distant calling of an animal she could not identify, the creaking of metal and the temperature drop of the small hours. She lay in the sleeping bag in the truck cab and stared at the roof and listened, and at some point before dawn she made the decision, not dramatically, not as a moment of transformation, but quietly and with some exhaustion, that she would learn what Arthur had been doing out here, whatever it took and however long. She began the following morning. The most logical starting point was the truck she had identified as different from the others, a military surplus vehicle parked in the northeast corner of the yard, its surface painted over several times in colors that had all eventually lost their distinction and merged into a uniform dark green that had itself oxidized to something closer to black. The welds on its doors were newer than the surrounding rust, she could see that clearly, and the hood had been modified to open from the back rather than the front, an inversion of the standard design that must have required deliberate effort. She spent most of the morning working on it with a pry bar before she gave up on the hood entirely and started on the seam around the rear compartment instead. The pry bar was Arthur's, a heavy steel thing that she had always thought was unnecessarily large, and now understood was exactly the right size. She worked the seam methodically, moving along at every few inches, and the corroded metal resisted her, and her shoulders burned with the effort, and her hands were bleeding in 2 places from the sharp edges before she had gone 3 feet. She rested in the shade of the vehicle and drank water from the jug and looked at her hands and thought about nothing for a while. She went back to work. The rear compartment gave way around midday, the seam separating with a sound like a small explosion. A flat crack followed by the protesting screech of metal that had been fused for years, suddenly experiencing movement again. She caught the panel before it fell and lowered it to the ground with the caution of exhaustion rather than care. Inside the compartment, packed tightly enough that nothing had shifted in years, were rolled steel, roofing sheets, lengths of copper, tubing in various diameters, bundled with wire, and bags of waterproof sealant that had dried in their packaging but had not yet completely hardened. She stared at this for a long time without understanding it. The copper tubing in particular held her attention. She lifted one of the bundles and turned it in her hands, and the copper was cold against her palms. Even in the heat of midday, the way copper always is, holding its temperature against the assault of the air around it, and she thought that Arthur had handled these same tubes, had bent and cut and fitted them, according to some plan she did not yet have access to, and the thought was less sad than she had expected. It was almost like a conversation. The metal box was not where she had been looking. She found it by accident, or by the particular kind of accident that is also the inevitable result of sustained attention. She was working her way around the outside of the military vehicle, looking for additional welded seams, when the tip of the pry bar slipped under a section of skirting she had not noticed before, a section that turned out to be a false panel bolted over the original chassis. When the panel came away, it revealed a recessed compartment, perhaps 8 inches deep and 2 feet wide, running the full length of the vehicle's side. The metal box sat in the center of this compartment. It was smaller than she had imagined when she thought about it later, which was perhaps why she had dismissed the possibility of something like it, because she had been looking for something large, something obvious, something proportional to the scale of whatever Arthur had been building out here. But the box was perhaps 12 inches by 8, and it was sealed with what looked like a weld, but revealed itself to her careful inspection to be a very fine seam of epoxy meticulously applied and sanded flush, with the surface to look like a weld from a distance. Arthur had not wanted someone to find this casually. She worked the epoxy with the thin blade of a utility knife for over an hour, working slowly, trying not to damage what might be inside. And the caution she brought to the task was itself a kind of realization, because she understood midway through that she was behaving as though she already knew the contents were important, and she had not consciously decided to believe that yet. The lid came away. The leather notebook was the first thing she saw sitting on top of the rolled technical drawings. The leather was dry and stiff from the desert storage, its cover worn at the corners, but intact, and it was tied shut with a piece of braided wire rather than a clasp or a strap. She set it aside without opening it because the instinct was to look at the drawings first, to understand the physical reality before she tried to understand what Arthur had been thinking and feeling while he created it. She unrolled the first drawing on the hood of the truck, holding it flat with one hand and a spare bolt she found in her pocket, and looked at it for a very long time. It was a system. She could see that immediately, even without being able to read all the annotations or follow every line back to its component. It was not a random collection of parts or a schematic for a single device, but a complete and interconnected system, something that depended on every element being in relationship with every other element. The way a living thing is not merely the sum of its organs, but the particular arrangement of them and the flows between them. The trucks she began to understand were not raw material. They were structure. They were the bones of something. She unrolled the second drawing, and then the third. She sat cross-legged on the ground in the hot afternoon and spread the drawings around her and moved between them, and the language of technical illustration came back to her slowly and imperfectly from the drafting course she had taken at community college 40 years ago, before she had met Arthur, before she had expected her life to go in any particular direction. She could read enough. She could read enough to understand the basics of what she was looking at. The trucks were arranged to create an enclosed space. The arrangement she had noticed without understanding the careful grouping and positioning was not aesthetic or organizational. It was functional. The vehicles formed the walls of a system, and the system was designed to capture water from the desert air. She held the third drawing up and compared it to her view of the yard, and she could see it now, could see the way the positions of the vehicles corresponded to the elements of the drawing, could see the cleared central space as the collection point, could see the glass of the windshields as the crucial element they were. The desert air contains moisture. Not much, not in the way that humid climates do, but measurable amounts, and the amounts that seem negligible to a person change significantly when you are engineering for precision rather than relying on impression. The system Arthur had designed worked by exploiting the extreme temperature swings of the desert climate, the murderous heat of the day, and the startling cold of the night temperatures that could differ by 60 degrees or more in a single cycle. In the daytime heat, the dark metal surfaces absorbed solar energy and created temperature gradient ohms that drew whatever moisture existed in the deep soil, in the degraded materials in the yard, upward through convection, where the greenhouse effect created by the angled windshields and the copper-lined surfaces began a slow evaporation cycle. At night, when the desert dropped toward cold, with a speed that still surprised her after all the time she had lived in proximity to it, the cool glass surfaces caused that evaporated moisture to condense and run along channels Arthur had cut into the copper lining, following precise angles calculated to keep the water moving at a consistent rate toward collection points that fed the buried pipes that ran to the central cleared area. The cleared area was where the water arrived. She looked at the notebook then. Arthur's handwriting was familiar, its particular compressed quality, each letter formed with the efficiency of a person who thought faster than he wrote, and had developed a script that tried to keep pace. The notebook was dated entries going back 9 years. 9 years of coming out to this place that everyone in Crail County regarded as a joke, 9 years of patient engineering carried out in a location chosen specifically because no one would look at it carefully, would look at it at all, because it already had a story that everyone accepted and no one questioned. The last entry was dated 11 days before Arthur had gone to the hospital for the last time. It read in full, "The Eastern Collector needs 2 more sections to close the final gap." I think Eleanor will understand when she finds this. She always understood things I couldn't explain. She read that sentence several times. She read it until the sun was close enough to the horizon that the shadows of the trucks were long across the sand and the temperature was beginning its precipitous descent, and her hands, she realized, had stopped shaking sometime in the previous hour without her noticing. She sat with a notebook in her lap and looked at the yard around her and understood that she was not sitting in the wreckage of a failed man's life. She was sitting in the unfinished work of a very patient, very precise, and very far-sighted mind. And the laughter from the notary's office sounded different in her memory, now less like condemnation and more like the particular sound that people make when they encounter something they are not equipped to recognize. She did not smile. She was too tired to smile and too close to something that felt fragile and enormous at the same time, like standing near a river that is still underground and can only be heard, not seen. But she put the notebook in her canvas bag with the document from Boone's office, and she looked at the yard for a long moment before it was too dark to see it clearly, and she thought with the quiet certainty of someone who has just discovered that the map they thought was useless was in fact describing the exact territory they are standing in, that she had work to do, that there was in fact everything to do, and that there was not a moment to waste. She burned her hand on the 3rd morning. Not badly, not in the way that requires a hospital, but badly enough that the blister rose across 3 fingers of her right hand before the afternoon was done, and she sat with her hands submerged in the water jug and looked at the blister and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not pain, though the pain was real enough. What she felt was close to satisfaction. The kind that arrives when a body registers that it is doing something actual, something that leaves a mark, something that cannot be mistaken for simply waiting. She had been waiting without knowing it for 11 days, reading the notebook, walking the system Arthur had laid out and matching each element to its place in the drawings, cataloging the copper tubing by diameter and length, counting the bags of sealant, taking inventory of every welded seam, every angled surface, every piece of tinted glass positioned in its specific orientation toward the sky. Learning the yard the way a person learns a language, not from a book, but from immersion, from mistake and correction and gradual accumulation of understanding. And all of that had been necessary, but it had not been building. She needed to start building. The problem presented itself to her in the flat arithmetic of physical reality. Arthur's system, as documented in the drawings, required specific assembly steps that demanded 2 sets of hands at minimum and 3 at certain critical junctures. The central collector basin needed to be positioned and sealed by 2 people working in concert because the basin was constructed from the modified bed of a 1-ton truck, and the sections would not hold their alignment without simultaneous pressure applied from both ends. The angled copper runs that fed the collection channels required someone to maintain tension at the upper end while the lower fittings were soldered. There were moments in the system, Arthur had annotated them clearly, with small red marks in the margins of the 3rd drawing, where a single person proceeding alone would undo with one motion what they had spent hours constructing. Arthur had known this, she understood now. He had known he was not going to finish this alone. He had known for some time that he was going to need her. She lay in the truck that night with the notebook open to the last page and the flashlight balanced on her knee, reading the entry again, the one about the Eastern Collector and the 2 additional sections needed to close the final gap. He had written 11 days before his last hospitalization. She thought about the word will in that entry. I think Eleanor will understand. And she heard in it the specific register of a man who has made peace with his timeline he cannot control. He had been leaving her the instructions. The entire yard had been his way of leaving her the instructions, the notebooks, and the drawings stored in the seal box, the copper and the sealant stored where they would survive the desert climate until she found them, the vehicles positioned so that any person who took the time to look carefully would see the geometry of a system rather than the chaos of abandonment. He had trusted her to look carefully. He had spent 31 years watching her look carefully at things, and he had trusted that when it mattered most, she would do it again. She closed the notebook. She thought about Theodore Okafor, who everyone called Mr. T, and who lived in a converted storage unit at the western edge of town that he had been renting for 12 years and had somehow transformed into a place that felt, when you stepped inside it, like the interior of a life fully inhabited. She had not seen him since Arthur's funeral, where he had stood at the back of the church with his hat in both hands and his eyes red-rimmed and said nothing to anyone, not because he was cold, but because she had always understood that his grief was the kind that did not perform itself. He and Arthur had known each other since before she had entered the picture, two young men working at the Crail County mechanical plant in an era when the plant still ran 3 shifts, and the friendship they had formed there had survived the plant's closure, 2 marriages, and 1 divorce between them and the slow-grinding economic pressures that had remade this part of the world in the 4 decades since. Mr. T was 73 years old now. His hands shook slightly when he poured coffee, not from weakness, but from the accumulated tremor of 60-plus years of work, the kind of work that vibrates its way into the joints and stays there. His lungs were not what they had been, which was itself a vast understatement, because they had never been good, not since the plant days, not since the years of metal dust and inadequate ventilation, and the particular institutional indifference toward workers' bodies that characterized that era in this industry. He used an inhaler twice daily and sometimes more, and he had told Arthur once during one of their conversations that Eleanor had overheard without meaning to, that he figured he had used up most of his breaths already and was operating on the remainder with appropriate appreciation. She drove to his place early the next morning before the heat established itself and knocked on the metal door that had been painted red at some point and was now a color somewhere between rust and intention. He opened the door in his work clothes. She realized he was already dressed to come to her. "Arthur told me," he said without preamble, "about the yard. He told me 6 months before he passed." He paused and looked past her at the truck. "He said you'd come when you were ready and not before, and that I should wait." She said, "I need your hands." He picked up a toolbox from beside the door that was already packed. The dynamic between them in those first days was one of calibration. Eleanor knew the system from the drawings, had internalized the geometry and the sequence with the thoroughness of someone who had had 2 weeks of uninterrupted study in the particular focus that grief redirected produces. Mr. T knew the materials and the methods, knew the specific behavior of copper pipe under desert heat, knew which grades of sealant held at which temperature ranges and which failed catastrophically 6 months in. They were each in possession of half a map, and the work of those first days was less about the physical construction than about learning to read each other's path. He did not explain things twice. She appreciated this about him immediately. He would demonstrate a technique once with the economy of a person who has spent his life working alongside people who were expected to be competent, and then he would watch while she attempted it and correct her if necessary with a word or a gesture rather than a repeated demonstration. She cut copper pipe with the wrong angle on the second morning, a cut that was off by perhaps 3 degrees, and he held it up and looked at it and said again, "Nothing more." She cut it again. He looked at the angle and nodded and moved on. The welding was harder. She had never welded before, had been in the general vicinity of welding on a handful of occasions, and had registered it as something that involved heat and light in a particular focused intensity, but had never been the person holding the torch. Mr. T set her up on a section of sacrificial steel plate on the first afternoon and let her run beads until the motion felt natural, or at least less foreign. The arc sparked against her welding helmet with a sound she could feel in her back teeth. The heat pressed against her from all directions in the desert midday, a double assault of ambient temperature and radiant torch heat that produced a specific and total exhaustion unlike anything she had experienced. Her first real weld on the system was on the eastern collector section, the gap Arthur had noted in his last entry. Mr. T watched the weld without comment. When she finished and raised her helmet, he crouched down and ran a thumbnail along the bead. "It'll hold," he said. She had not known until that moment how much she needed to hear those 2 words from someone who understood what holding meant. The days organized themselves around the work. She rose before light and began with the tasks that required coolness, the precision cutting, and the fitting of connections, because in the early morning her hands were steadier and the metal was cold enough to be handled without gloves. As the sun climbed, they moved to the heavy labor, the repositioning of the vehicle sections that needed adjustment, the mixing and application of sealant to the collector channels. In the brutal window of early afternoon, they rested in the shade of the largest truck, drinking water and reviewing the drawings, and Mr. T would sometimes fall asleep sitting upright against the tire, his chin dropping to his chest, and she would sit beside him and look at the drawings and let him sleep, because she could see the cost the work was extracting from him, and she refused to be the person who demanded more than a person could give. He never asked for rest himself. This was his own difficulty. The physical transformation of her body during those weeks was something she tracked with a detached curiosity that helped her manage the discomfort of it. Her hands, which had been a widow's hands soft from the specific softness of a life lived indoors in grief, became something else entirely. The blisters that rose and burst and rose again on her palms eventually gave way to a layer of callus that she ran her thumb across in the evenings, the way she might have checked the texture of a fabric, assessing its development. Her forearms, where the edges of metal sheeting had caught her repeatedly as she worked in the tight spaces between vehicle undercarriages, were mapped with thin scars that the desert sun darkened to a bronze against her pale skin. She did not look at herself in the rearview mirror. She was not avoiding herself exactly, but there was something about watching her own face change that felt premature, felt like a kind of accounting that should wait until there was something finished to account for. They hit the first serious obstacle on the 19th day. The central basin section, the modified truck bed that needed to be positioned and sealed simultaneously from both ends, weighed considerably more than either of them had estimated from the drawings. Arthur's annotations indicated a specific rigging approach using the overhead structure of two adjacent vehicle frames as a lifting point, and in theory, the approach was sound, but in practice, the overhead frames had experienced more structural deterioration than the drawings made years earlier had been able to anticipate. When they attempted the first lift, one of the frame sections flexed visibly under the load, a slow and ominous bowing that stopped them both before anything gave way. Mr. T stood back and looked at the frame with the expression of a man revising several calculations simultaneously. She stood beside him and waited. "We need a spreader bar," he said finally, 2 feet wider than what we have. She looked around the yard. She was learning to see the yard as a parts inventory rather than a collection of discarded objects. "The rear axle of the flatbed in row 3, she said. "It's the right diameter." He looked at her and then looked at the flatbed. "Yes," he said. "And then Arthur always said you were the one who could see things whole." She turned away before her face could respond. They fabricated the spreader bar over the following 2 days, cutting the axle section to length and welding attachment points at precise intervals, and the work of those 2 days was technical in a way that left no room for anything other than the problem in front of them, which was a relief. When they returned to the lift on the 22nd day, the modified rigging held. The basin section rose smoothly and settled into its mounting position, and they worked the ceiling compound along both ends simultaneously, Mr. T at the southern end and Eleanor at the north, and the compound set in the afternoon heat faster than expected, which required them to work with an urgency that precluded anything except movement. When it was done, they sat on either side of the sealed basin and did not speak for a while. The rhythm of the weeks had a texture she would not have been able to describe to someone who had not experienced it. There was the physical rhythm, the daily arc from precision work to heavy labor, to review and rest, and within that a subtler rhythm, the rhythm of a complex system revealing itself as it was assembled, because each completed element made the next element's relationship to the whole clearer, and understanding accumulated the way the condensation water would eventually accumulate one small quantity at a time in an amount that only became significant when you stopped looking at the individual drops and looked instead at the volume they had combined to form. Mr. T began coughing more in the 5th week. She had been aware of his cough from the beginning, had registered it as a constant, the way you register the sound of wind or the sound of a generator, something present in the background of all other sounds. But in the 5th week, it changed and character became denser and more frequent, and she could hear in it something that the earlier cough had not contained, a quality that reminded her of the sound of the rigging, flexing under the basin load, a structural sound, the sound of something working harder than it was designed to work. He did not mention it, she did not mention it. They had established, without discussing it, a protocol of mutual respect that expressed itself partly as the refusal to acknowledge each other's limitations, because to acknowledge them would be to introduce the possibility of stopping and neither of them was going to stop. She began without telling him to arrange the work so that the heaviest tasks fell to her when possible. She reorganized the sequence of assembly steps in the 6th week to front-load the tasks he could do, sitting the fitting of the small diameter tubing connections, the application of sealant to the interior channels, the calibration of the collection angles using the leveling tools Arthur had stored with the drawings. She told him she was reordering the sequence because of a logistical discovery she had made in the drawings, which was partially true, and he accepted the explanation with a look that suggested he understood more than he was acknowledging, and they continued. The eastern array of collectors, the final major component, went up over 3 days in the 7th week. These were the angled glass panels, windshields removed from the outermost trucks and reset in copper frames at the specific angles Arthur had calculated. Angles that had to be precise to within 2 degrees, or the condensation runoff would miss the collection channels entirely. Mr. T had built adjustable mounting brackets from the spare steel in the early weeks, anticipating this requirement, and their design was elegant enough that Eleanor had stopped and looked at them for a long moment when he first showed her. "You could have been an engineer," she said. He considered this. Arthur used to say that the difference between an engineer and a machinist is about $40,000 of education and a preference for air-conditioned offices. He paused. "I always preferred the work." That was the last full conversation they had, not because anything ended it, but because after that the work entered its final phase, and the final phase required a concentration that displaced everything else. The pressure valve was the last installation. Arthur's drawings called for a specific type of pressure relief valve on the main collection line, a safeguard against the buildup that could occur during the high evaporation periods of extreme heat when the system would run at its highest output, and the water pressure in the collection pipes would peak accordingly. They had found the valve in the last days of the 4th week, packed carefully in an oil-soaked cloth inside the engine compartment of the military vehicle, waiting for exactly this moment. Mr. T had been the one to find it, reaching into the compartment with arms thin enough to navigate the access point that Eleanor's hands could not quite reach, and he had held the valve up in the afternoon light and turned it slowly and said nothing, but the expression on his face was the expression of a person touching something made by the hands of a friend they had outlived, and she had looked away to give him the privacy of it. They installed the valve together on the 44th day of working the yard in the late afternoon when the heat had begun its first retreat. Mr. T seated the valve fitting from below, while Eleanor tightened the upper coupling from above, and they called the torque count back and forth to each other, and when the final setting was reached and Eleanor called it, she heard him say, "Good," from below in a voice that was quieter than usual, and she started to ask if he needed to rest. She heard him settle against the pipe. She came around the side of the vehicle and found him sitting with his back against the main collection pipe, both hands open in his lap, his head resting against the metal at the angle of a man who has simply decided to rest where he is. His eyes were closed, his chest was moving slowly and with effort, the way she had watched the flexing rigging move under the basin load, finding the limit of what it could sustain. She knelt beside him. She took his hand. The calluses on his palm were harder than hers, the accumulation of a longer life of physical labor, and his hand was very cold in the heat of the afternoon, which frightened her in a way she had not been frightened in the previous 7 weeks. Not by blister or failed weld or collapsing rigging, because those had been problems with solutions, and this was not a problem with a solution. He opened his eyes. He looked at her with the clear attention of a man who has been somewhere and returned. "Is it done?" he asked. "The valve is set," she said. "The system is complete." He looked past her at the assembled yard, at the geometry they had built together over 44 days, at the angled glass and the copper lines and the sealed basin at the center of it all. He looked at it the way Arthur used to look at things he had built, with the particular satisfaction of someone seeing a thought made physical. "Good," he said again. She sat beside him and held his hand and did not let go, and the desert evening came down around them the way it always did, fast and complete, and carrying that particular cold that the desert produces the moment the sun relinquishes its claim, and she stayed where she was. Theodore Okafor died at dusk on the 44th day, with the completed system around him, and her hand in his, and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky overhead. She sat with him for a long time after. She did not cry, not because she was not grieving, but because she was very far past the kind of grief that expresses itself in tears. This was a different country of grief, quieter and more total, the kind that sits in the chest like ballast and keeps you upright when nothing else would. She buried him the following morning beneath the largest truck in the yard, at the spot she had chosen weeks earlier, in the part of her mind that makes those preparations without asking permission, under the extended shade that the vehicle threw in the late afternoon, which was the coolest place in the yard and the most sheltered from the wind. She marked the place with a length of copper pipe vertical in the desert floor, and she stood there for a while and said what she could say, which was not much, but was true. She went back to work. Not because she was not broken by it, but because the work was what he had come here to finish, and it was finished, and now she needed to know if it worked. She opened the main intake on the collection system that afternoon and sat in Arthur's canvas chair beside the central basin, the chair she had found folded inside the military vehicle and had set up weeks ago in the only gesture toward comfort she had allowed herself, and she waited. The desert night came in with its usual severity. The temperature dropped through the floor with a speed that still startled her. 40 degrees in 3 hours, the kind of temperature change that breaks rocks and contracts metal and does something precise and essential to the moisture in the air above a system designed to capture it. She heard it before she saw it, a sound so small that in any other context she would not have registered it as significant. A tapping, thin and regular, the sound of water dropping onto a dry surface, one drop at a time from the first copper collection point 6 feet above the basin. She held very still. A second drop followed, then a third more quickly. The tapping became irregular and then regular again, and the regularity increased, and in the lamplight, she could see the small dark spots appearing on the pale surface of the basin liner. The marks of water in a place that had not had water, and the spots were growing and the sound was growing with them. She pressed her hand flat against the cold copper of the main collection pipe and felt the vibration of it, felt the system working, felt Arthur's math made physical and Mr. T's hands made permanent in the sealed connections, in the calibrated angles, in the pressure valve set to its final position. The water ran. She lifted her palm and looked at the moisture on it, and then looked up at the desert sky, at the stars that had been there every night of those 7 weeks without ever offering anything, and she thought of the men in the notary's office. She thought of their laughter and what it had assumed. She thought of what they were going to need, and she thought of what she now had, and she thought of the particular way a joke becomes something else entirely when time strips away its premise. She did not know yet what was coming for the town. She did not know that the sky 60 miles to the west was already changing color in a way that the historical record had never quite documented, that instruments in the regional weather station were producing readings that the technician on duty would stare at for a full minute before picking up the phone, that the ancient mechanisms of climate were preparing something for this part of the world that would rewrite every assumption anyone in Crail County had ever made about survival and scarcity and who held the things worth having. She only knew that the water was running and that she was not going to stop it. The sky changed on a Thursday. Eleanor noticed it the way she had learned to notice things in the desert, not all at once, but through accumulation. The way the light shifted from its usual white severity to something with an orange undertone that did not belong to any hour of the day she recognized. The air had a weight to it by mid-morning, a density that pressed against the skin without moving the way water feels before it becomes current. She had been checking the collection basin levels, recording the overnight output in the notebook she had started keeping alongside Arthur's, and she stopped with the pencil in her hand and looked at the horizon to the west. The color there was wrong. She had lived in proximity to this desert for 30 years, and she knew its palette with the intimacy of long acquaintance, the bleached bone of midday, the violent orange of late afternoon, the specific purple that preceded the cold of night. What she saw on the western horizon was none of these. It was deeper and more settled, a color that had the quality of something that had arrived rather than something passing through, and it sat above the ridgeline without moving while everything else in the visible world remained still. The birds had stopped. She had not registered this consciously until she noticed the silence and then understood its specific quality, the absence not of wind, which she was accustomed to, but of the small desert birds that moved through the yard each morning, the ones she had begun naming in her mind for her own company, the quick brown ones that picked insects from the copper fittings and the larger gray ones that sat on the highest vehicle roofs and watched the yard with a proprietorial air. They were gone. The silence they left was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath. She pulled Arthur's notebook from the canvas bag and found the section near the back where he had written about the system's performance projections under extreme heat conditions. He had modeled scenarios going up to 55 degrees Celsius in the ambient air. He had noted at the bottom of that page in handwriting, slightly different from the surrounding text, as though added at a different time, that the system's output would increase proportionally with temperature differential up to a theoretical maximum, and that conditions producing that maximum had never been recorded in the regional climate history. He had underlined the word yet. She closed the notebook and looked at the western sky and understood that Arthur Voss, who had spent the last decade of his life building a machine for conditions no one else believed were coming, had been right about the timeline as well. The heat arrived the following morning with a totality that was almost abstract, a temperature that ceased to feel like weather and began to feel like a physical law, like gravity, like something that had simply always been true and would continue to be true until it decided otherwise. Eleanor had prepared as much as she could in the 12 hours between seeing the sky and the heat's arrival, filling every container in the yard with the overnight collection, sealing the water storage against evaporation, wetting down the exterior copper surfaces to reduce their temperature before the sun took full command. By 7 in the morning, the thermometer she had salvaged and mounted on the central pipe read 131 degrees Fahrenheit. By 9, it had climbed past what the thermometer was designed to measure, and she had to estimate from there. She stayed inside the military vehicle, which she had lined with the reflective sheeting in the second week of construction, for exactly this contingency, Arthur's notes having specified that the crew shelter should be the modified armored cab, whose mass and insulation made it the coolest structure in the yard by 15 degrees under extreme conditions. She had water. She had the notebooks. She had the small battery radio that Mr. T had brought on his first day, in which she had kept on the shelf he had built above the passenger seat. The radio told her what was happening in town. The announcer's voice had the controlled urgency of someone trying to communicate seriousness without producing panic and failing on both counts. The municipal water system had been operating under pressure for 3 days before the heat-broke demand had been running at 4 times the normal level, as everyone with a lawn or a pool or a fear of scarcity had been drawing from it simultaneously. And the aquifer that fed the system had been declining for years before any of this, quietly and without announcement, the way important things decline when no one is required to look at them directly. Under the load of the crisis demand, the system pressure had dropped to the point where water from the mains reached only the lowest elevations in town reliably. Everything above the 3rd Street from the valley floor was running on whatever people had stored. The announcer said the word crisis 4 times in 2 minutes. She turned the radio down and sat with the notebooks in her shram and thought about the men in the notary's office. They had been confident in a very specific way. The confidence of people who believed that the systems supporting their lives were as permanent as the ground they stood on, and that the ground itself was permanent, and that permanence was in general the nature of things for people like them. She had once believed something adjacent to this, not through arrogance, but through the ordinary human assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday in its fundamental provisions. Arthur's decade of quiet work in this yard had been, among other things, his answer to that assumption, his refusal of it, his insistence on preparing for the thing that most people preferred to believe was not coming. She thought about the silver-haired man in the front row of Boone's office, his sideways smile. She thought about the young man in the too large jacket who had laughed until he pressed his hand over his mouth. She thought about what they were drinking right now, if they were drinking anything. She thought about their children. Then she stopped thinking about it and checked the collection basin. The system was running at a rate she had never seen before. The extreme temperature differential, the desert day reaching its catastrophic peak, while the copper lines retained the cold of the previous night in their deep sections, was driving the evaporation and condensation cycle at its theoretical maximum, the number Arthur had calculated in his notebook with the underlined word beneath it. She stood in the heat for 30 seconds to check the flow meter she had built from salvage parts. In the 3rd week, a simple float gauge mounted on the basin inlet, and what she saw made her stand still for a moment, despite the temperature. The system was producing approximately 8 times its normal daily output. She went back inside the shelter. She did not make any decision in a dramatic way. The decision had been made the moment she opened the main valve on the 44th day and heard the first drops hit the basin floor. Or perhaps before that, perhaps the moment she had driven Arthur's truck out to the yard for the first time and stood inside the gate and looked at what he had left her. She had known then, even without knowing what the yard was, that she was going to do something with it. The content of the doing had changed as understanding accumulated, but the direction had not. She opened the gate on the second morning of the heat event. Not all the way. She removed the padlock and left the gate standing open by a foot enough to signal invitation without removing the boundary entirely, because she had learned in 44 days of construction that boundaries were structural, that they existed to direct force rather than simply to exclude it. No one came that day. She had expected this. Pride is its own kind of conservation effort. The people in town were managing what they had and rationalizing the situation in the ways that humans manage and rationalize, when the alternative is admitting that the thing they laughed at was the thing that could save them. She sat in the shelter and read and drank measured quantities of her stored water and watched the basin fill. They came on the third day. She heard the sound of an engine struggling in the heat before she saw the vehicle, a late model SUV, the color of sand, moving along the dirt track toward the yard, with the slow, careful movement of a vehicle being driven by someone who was not accustomed to unpaved roads and was also possibly not in full physical command of themselves. It stopped outside the open gate and sat there for a while, engine running. Then the engine stopped. A woman got out. She was perhaps 40, well-dressed in the disarrayed way of someone who had been well-dressed some days ago and had not had the resources to maintain it since. She was carrying a child, a boy of perhaps 3 or 4, and the child's face was flushed in a way that Eleanor could see from 50 feet away was not healthy. The woman stood outside the gate and looked at the open foot of space and did not move. Eleanor walked to the gate and opened it fully. She did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and she was past the age and the grief and the 44 days of physical transformation that would have produced either hostility or the particular performance of magnanimity that hostile people produce when they choose to be generous. She simply opened the gate and stepped back and made a gesture with her head toward the central basin. The woman came through. She walked to the basin tap, which Eleanor had installed on the second day of the heat, a simple spigot at the basin outlet, and she turned it and held the child's face under the stream, and then her own face, and the sound she made was not a word. By evening, there were 9 people in the yard. The next morning, there were more. She did not count them after the first day. The counting was not the point. She directed people to the basin tap and to the shade structures she had improvised from the vehicle tarps, and she maintained the system, checking the flow meters and the seal integrity and the pressure valve that Mr. T had set on the 44th day and which had not required adjustment since. The system ran. The water came. The people drank. On the 4th day of the heat, she saw the silver-haired man. He had not driven. He had walked, which told her something about how far his resources had declined, because men like him did not walk to things they expected to be beneath them. He was wearing clothes that had been expensive a week ago and were now simply dirty. He stood outside the open gate for a long time longer than the woman with the child had stood there, and Eleanor watched him from across the yard without moving. He was a man of 70 or so, she could see now at this distance, and without the distortion of his assumed authority. He was simply an old man who was very hot and very thirsty and standing outside a gate that was standing open. The humiliation of the moment was written across every line of his body, and she felt it not as satisfaction, but as something closer to sorrow, because she was old enough to know that humiliation of this kind, the kind that arrives without warning and strips away every assumption, is its own form of suffering, regardless of whether it is deserved. She walked to the gate. She looked at him without expression, not because she was suppressing something, but because she had genuinely arrived through the process of the previous months at a place of equanimity that was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of steadiness alongside it. She had been to the bottom of things and found it solid and come back up, and the people who had laughed at her had not made that journey, and she did not hold this against them, except in the private accounting that every honest person keeps. She said, "Come in out of the heat." He came in. He drank from the tap with his hands cupped under it, and she stood at a distance and let him have the moment without witness, because she understood that dignity is sometimes the most useful thing you can offer a person, more useful than water, though in this case she was offering both. The others came over the following 2 days. Some she recognized from the notary's office. Some she did not recognize but understood from their manner and their dress to be people for whom this situation represented a category of experience entirely outside anything they had prepared for. She treated all of them the same way. She opened the gate. She pointed to the tap. She maintained the system. Reginald Boone arrived on the 6th day. He had lost the tan somehow, which she had not thought was possible in the middle of a heat event, but which she supposed was what happened when the blood left the surface of a person's skin and retreated inward. He looked smaller than he had in his office, and she understood that offices are a form of costume, and that without his, he was simply a thin man of 60 who was frightened and sorry in ways he did not have the vocabulary for. He stood in front of her for a moment, and she waited. "Mrs. Voss," he said, and then he stopped. "There's water at the tap," she said. He nodded. He went to the tap. He did not try to say whatever he had been about to say, and she was grateful for this, because she had no interest in apologies that arrived at the point of desperation, not because she would not eventually accept them, but because this was not the time. The time for certain conversations was not when a man was dying of thirst. You gave the water first. The conversation could wait for when people were restored to themselves. The regional emergency coordinator arrived in an official vehicle on the 7th day of the heat event, accompanied by a younger woman with a tablet computer and a harried expression, and he introduced himself as Marcus Webb and said he had been told there was a water source at this location and could he assess it. She showed him the system. He walked through the yard with her, and she watched his face as he followed the lines of copper from the collection arrays on the vehicle rooftops, to the sealed channels in the modified truck beds, to the central basin in the tap, where even as they walked, a man in a dirty polo shirt was filling a plastic gallon jug with a focused attention that suggested he was going to be very careful with every ounce of it. Webb stopped at his pressure valve, and then I looked at it for a long time, Meg. He looked at the collection angle of the eastern array. He crouched down and looked at the basin ceiling compound and pressed his thumbnail against it the way Mr. T had pressed his thumbnail against her first weld, and she felt a pang of something sharp and sweet in the same moment. He stood up and looked at her. "Who designed this?" he asked. "My husband," she said, "Arthur Voss." He was quiet for a moment. "The patent holder, the engineer." He looked around the yard with an expression that was recalibrating itself in real time. "I knew the name. I didn't know he was here." "Most people didn't," she said. That was somewhat the point. Webb called someone on his radio. He walked the perimeter of the yard twice more while he was on the radio, looking at the system from different angles, and she could hear in the fragments of his conversation the particular cadence of a person communicating something unexpected to people who are going to need time to absorb it. He came back to her with the younger woman who had been recording notes on the tablet throughout. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I need to ask you something directly. This system as it stands is currently the only functioning water source within a 12-mile radius that we have confirmed. The municipal system is at approximately 4% pressure. We have 2 hospitals, 1 care facility, and an estimated 11,000 residents who need water in the next 48 hours. He paused. "Are you in a position to expand output?" She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since the second morning when she had opened the gate and stood back. "The system has room to expand along the northern fence line," she said. "There are 6 vehicles positioned there that my husband's drawings indicate were intended as a secondary array. We have the materials. I need 2 people who can follow technical instructions, and I need them to be able to work in the heat." Webb looked at the younger woman. The younger woman looked at her tablet and said, "I can get you 4. 2 will be enough," Eleanor said, because she had learned in 44 days what was enough and what was excess, and excess in a crisis was its own kind of problem. The secondary array went up over 30 hours. Webb's 2 people were not machinists and they were not engineers, but they were willing, and willingness combined with precise instruction and the particular clarifying force of necessity is a formidable working combination. She directed and they built, and the copper lines from the northern array joined the main collection system, On the morning of the 9th day of the heat event, and the output increased by a factor that she recorded in her notebook with Arthur's pencil and then sat with for a long moment. The crisis lasted 11 days in total. On the 12th day, the temperature broke not all the way back to normal, but to a level at which the municipal system could begin partial restoration, and the emergency coordinator formally reclassified the situation from critical to managed. Eleanor sat in Arthur's canvas chair beside the central basin on the evening of the 12th day and drank a cup of coffee from the camp stove and watched the light change over the yard. The formal acknowledgement came 3 weeks later. She had not expected anything formal or anything at all, and when a government vehicle appeared at the gate on a Tuesday morning in what passed for the cooler season in this part of the world, she assumed it was a follow-up inspection of the kind that bureaucracies conduct when they are still processing what happened and need documentation to help them understand it. The man who got out was not Webb. He was older than Webb, and he was dressed with the particular care of someone for whom presentation is a professional tool, and he introduced himself as Dr. Raymond Chen, Senior Engineer, with the state's Office of Water Resources, and he had with him a leather satchel and an expression of focused concentration. He did not begin with pleasantries. He said, "I've spent the past 3 weeks studying every drawing in the collection your husband left, and I came here because I needed to see the physical installation to understand 2 elements that I could not reconcile with the drawings." She said, "Which elements?" "The secondary condensation gradient," he said, "in the eastern array, and the pressure valve placement. Both of them represent the solutions to engineering problems that my office has been attempting to solve with significant resources for approximately 7 years." He paused. Arthur Voss solved them, in a salvage yard in the desert, using decommissioned commercial vehicles and copper pipe. She said he had a lot of time to think. Dr. Chen removed his hat. It was a small and precise gesture, and it was directed not at her, but at the yard, at the assembled system, at the presence in it of Arthur James Voss, who had spent a decade building a machine that people would need before anyone admitted they needed it. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "the state would like to formally document this system. We would like, with your permission, to use it as the technical basis for a broader regional implementation. We would like your name and your husband's name on the documentation." He paused. "And I want to say, for whatever it is worth, from a stranger, that what you built here, in the conditions you built it in, and what you did with it when the crisis came, is not something I have a precedent for in 40 years of working in this field." She looked at him for a moment. "My husband built it," she said. "Theodore Okafor helped me finish it." She looked at the spot beneath the largest truck. "His name goes on the documentation as well." "Absolutely, Bamao," Dr. Chen said without hesitation. "All 3 names." She nodded. She poured him a cup of coffee from the camp stove, and they sat on either side of the central basin in the morning light and went through the drawings together, and she answered his questions with the precision of someone who had lived inside a system for long enough to understand not just what it did, but why every element of it was the shape it was. The town began its own reckoning in the weeks that followed, quietly and without announcement, in the way that communities processed the gap between who they believed themselves to be and what a crisis revealed. Several of the men from the notary's office came to the yard individually, not together, which she understood because collective shame is harder to carry than individual shame, and what they needed to do required some privacy. They came and they sat with her in the shade of the vehicle where Mr. T was buried, and they said the things they could manage to say, which varied in adequacy and sincerity, but which she accepted in the spirit they were offered, because she had learned in the previous months that the currency of reconciliation is imperfect, and yet it is the only currency available. The silver-haired man came on a Saturday. He sat in the camp chair she offered him and looked at the copper pipe marking Mr. T's grave and was quiet for a long time. He said, "I voted against your husband's proposal to the county water board in 2019. He brought drawings. He said the aquifer was in decline and the county needed alternative infrastructure. We thought he was being alarmist." He stopped. "I want you to know I understand now what that vote cost." She looked at him. She thought about what it cost a man of his specific formation to sit in a salvage yard on a Saturday morning and say those words to a woman he had laughed at. She thought about Arthur, who had brought his drawings to the county water board, and been dismissed, and who had then come back out here and continued anyway without bitterness because the work was the point, and the work did not stop being necessary simply because the people who needed it refused to recognize the need. "My husband didn't build this to be right," she said. "He built it because people were going to need water." The silver-haired man looked at the ground. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a person who is accepting something that will take a long time to fully absorb. "What's your name?" she asked. She realized she had never known it. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Marsh." "There's water at the tap, Daniel," she said. "Same as for everyone." He filled a jug at the tap and drove away, and she watched him go and then went back to checking the flow meters, which was what she had been doing when he arrived and what needed to be done, regardless of anything else. The state's formal documentation process took several months. Dr. Chen returned 4 times each visit, longer than the last, and he brought colleagues on the 3rd and 4th visits, engineers and hydrologists who walked the yard with the notebooks and the drawings and asked her questions. She could always answer because she had spent enough time with the system to know it as well as she knew anything. The documentation would eventually describe Arthur's solar condensation system as a significant and original contribution to arid climate water capture technology. It would credit all 3 names in the manner she had specified. It would be used as the technical reference for installations in 7 counties across the state over the following 2 years. She did not attend any of the ceremonies associated with this because she was busy. The secondary array needed seasonal calibration adjustments in the winter months when the temperature differential shifted and the optimal collection angles changed. She had identified this from Arthur's notes and confirmed it through observation, and the work of calibration was precise and required her full attention. She had also begun a 3rd notebook, her own separate from Arthur's, in the record notebook, in which she wrote about what she was learning and what the system was teaching her and what she thought Arthur had understood that he had not been able to explain to anyone who was not willing to listen. She wrote about Mr. T in this notebook. She wrote about his hands and the spreader bar he had fabricated, and the way he had said "it'll hold" about her first weld, and about the expression on his face when he held the pressure valve up in the afternoon light, and about the fact that he had packed his toolbox the night before she arrived because he had known she was coming. She wrote about these things as precisely as she could because precision was the language of this place and because she wanted to get him right. She wrote about Arthur too, not about his death or his patents or his drawings, but about the man who had looked up from a water pump in 1989 with grease on his forearms and said without preparation that he intended to make something of himself so she might consider his company worth keeping. She wrote about the patience of a man who brought his work to people who rejected it and then went back out to the desert and continued the work anyway. She wrote about what it meant to build something for needs that had not yet declared themselves to act on behalf of a future that other people refused to imagine. She wrote, "He always said that a solution that helped people was its own reward. I spent 31 years taking this as modesty. I understand now that he meant it as a technical statement. The reward is real. It is not abstract. It exists in the physical world, in the water at the tap, in the sound of it, in the temperature of it against a person's face when they have had none for 3 days. The reward is the thing that works when it is needed. Everything else is waiting." She closed the notebook. She sat in Arthur's canvas chair in the late afternoon of a day in autumn when the desert had returned to something approaching its baseline severity and the air had the particular clarity that came in the season between the burning and the cold. The system ran around her with its quiet and continuous efficiency. The copper pipes caught the fading light and held it along their curves. The basin at the center of the yard held several hundred gallons of water that had not existed yesterday and would not exist tomorrow in any other form, only here, only through the specific arrangement of minds and materials and decades of patient work that had produced this place. She thought about what she had been given. Not the yard, not the system, not even the water. What she had been given was the unfinished thing, the sealed box, the 2 sections of the Eastern collector that needed closing, the invitation to participate in something that a man she loved had started and trusted her to continue. She had been given meaningful work at the moment when she had nothing else, and she understood that this was the rarest and most generous of gifts because it had asked something real of her and had returned something real in kind. The last of the light moved across the yard and caught the copper pipe above Meister T's grave and ran along it and went. She stayed until it was full dark because she had learned in the desert that the transition between day and night deserved attention, that the moment when the stars became visible was not. Nothing was in fact the moment when the system's overnight work began, when the temperature started its descent and the physics of evaporation and condensation asserted themselves with quiet and total authority in the copper and glass structure that Arthur had designed and she had built and Theodore Okafor had sealed with his final careful hands. The water would run tonight, it would run tomorrow night and the night after, as long as the structure held, and the desert maintained its temperature differential, and the work that had been done here remained sound, which she intended to ensure for as long as she was capable of ensuring it. She was not finished. She had not expected in the notary's office on the day of the 49th night to ever feel unfinished again, to feel that the forward motion of a life was something she was still inside of rather than something she was watching from a distance. That feeling was among the things the yard had returned to her, alongside the calluses on her palms and the third notebook, and the certain and unshakable knowledge of what her husband had been doing all those years, that everyone else thought he was tending a heap of rust. He had been building her a future. She had been building it too. She understood now the whole time in every decision she had made and every capability she had developed, and every year she had paid careful attention to things that others dismissed. They had been building it together without knowing they were doing it together the way long marriages build things without announcement, through the accumulated weight of shared attention and mutual trust and the particular knowledge of another person that only time and proximity and genuine interest can produce. The stars were fully out now. The system ran in the dark around her, not silently, but in the language of its own operation, the ticking of metal in the cold, the movement of water in the pipes, the sound of the desert being asked to give what it had and giving it. She put her hand on Arthur's canvas chair and sat with everything she had lost and everything she had built and everything that was still running, and the night came down around her, complete and clear and full of the sound of water.